The following program was made possible by funding from the UCF Office of Research and Commercialization.
This particular panel is to talk about energy security. And I think the premise of energy security is that we have a dependence or we require energy that we can't produce. So I think it's incumbent on us. We touched on it earlier, and Rich Holland did a great job of defining the term quads, so I don't have to say quadrillion, which is, of course, a really big number, and I can't tell you how many zeros it has, but it's a lot. I think it's important that we define for ourselves where, in fact, we are dependent. Is it coal? And the answer is no. Coal, we produce 24 quads, and we consume 22 quads in 2008. So clearly, coal is not where we're dependent. Now, as a state, we certainly are, because we don't have a coal mine in Florida, but nationally, we are not dependent on others for coal. Natural gas, somewhat the same story. We produce 21 quads of natural gas. We consume 24 quads of natural gas. So a little bit of a deficit, but not significant. Nuclear power, 8 quads produced, 8 quads consumed. Renewable power, 7 quads produced, 7 quads consumed. Petroleum, however, is where the gap is. We produce 10 quads of petroleum, we consume 37 quads. So that's where the challenge is. Approximately 30% of our BTUs in 2008 were imported. Now, where are we using all these quads? First, industrial use is predominant. We're using 31 quads for industry. Second, transportation, we're using 28 quads, residential 22 quads, and commercial 19. Now, transportation, that 28 quads, 95% of that is petroleum. So clearly, it's petroleum that is the challenge where we are dependent on others. Why is that a challenge? Well, the imports that we pull from our neighbors in the Persian Gulf and other regions are 16% of our energy comes from the Persian Gulf, or petroleum comes from the Persian Gulf. 44% comes from OPEC nations. And as you all know, not all OPEC nations are friendly to the U.S. Interestingly, just 2% of that petroleum is used to produce electricity. Again, the majority of it is for transportation. 5% is used globally for production of electricity. So clearly, the U.S. and Florida economy depend on economic transportation energy, and that's not going to change. So it's something that we have to pay significant attention to. So with that, we're going to jump right into our questions for our panelists, and my first is to Barney Bishop. And Barney, the premise of this panel suggests that independence is a great aspirational goal, yet for the last couple of decades, clearly global trade has been touted as a great thing for the U.S. and the economy. So what is it about energy that suggests independence versus global trade is a good thing?
Well, Jack, that's a great question, and I think that for the United States, and particularly for Florida, being a peninsula, access to energy and natural resources is going to be extremely important. AIF was the first business group back in December 2005 to endorse drilling, so I just wanted to acknowledge that so that y'all know where we're coming from. But when we did that, we also came out in favor of conservation. We came out in favor of efficiencies. We endorsed all renewables, and we also endorsed nuclear power. And so I appreciated the numbers that you were sharing. But I think that what's important for Floridians and ultimately for Americans are really 3 keystones. Number one, whatever energy that we're going to use has to be affordable for both consumers and for business. It has to be reliable. We can't afford to have brownouts because business can't operate like that. And then the third issue has got to be sustainability. We have to have access to energy that is going to be there for the future. And that, I think, is where green and renewable energy really is a place for Florida to concentrate on, solar probably being the greatest of that. But we believe that what's important is to keep those three issues paramount. And I think the Florida legislature has done a good job of focusing on trying to create a Florida energy policy. And I think we were not successful this past legislative session. However, the legislature did pass a bill called PACE, Property Assessment Clean Energy, that is an incentive for renewables. And so I think that we have a long way to go, but I think that if we work together and if we try to reach reasonable numbers and reasonable goals, that the business community is willing to help Florida to get to where it needs to be with respect to the kinds of energy that we're going to use. We're going to be in favor of all energy, from clean coal, fossil fuels, renewables, nuclear efficiency. What we need is the help of the legislature to establish that policy, and then for the Public Service Commission to then implement that policy so that energy producers have a predictable and a clear path of the direction that they need to go in so that they can continue to produce the energy, so that when you and I walk into a room and we flip that switch, we know that there in truth is going to be electricity there for us.
Thank you. As a follow-on, Barney, 8 of the 9 largest exporters of petroleum are dictatorship or autocratic kingdoms. Countries where 2/3 of the national income comes from oil. 22 are ruled by dictators, again, or autocratic kingdoms. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Absolutely. At the same time, I would tell you that the 2 largest providers of fossil fuel to the United States right now is Canada and Mexico. And so those are both generally friendly countries, especially Canada, Mexico from time to time. But there's no question that those of us in the business community are very concerned about those dictatorships and about the geopolitical circumstances that surround it. And when OPEC gets together and decides that they're going to raise the price of a barrel of oil, that's going to have a dramatic consequence on not only Florida's economy, but America's economy, the world's economy. So that's a reason why we need to move to a greener future. What we have to do, Jack, is to establish a roadmap of how we get there. In our opinion, it needs to be done in incremental ways that's not going to upset the apple cart of the way that we do business now. We're basically going to have to establish a paradigm shift. How do we allow utilities that produce energy for us, how do we do that in such a way, that those companies that now make money by producing more energy are going to be able to make money as we conserve energy and as we are more efficient in the future. So we've got some great demands, we've got some great minds. What we have to have, most importantly, is reasonableness. If the mantra of the environmental community is going to be that we have to have renewables at 20% by 2020, that's just a non-starter. What we have to have is an ability to sit down, agree to disagree, but respectfully sit down and work to try to make those numbers something that makes sense for everybody, and that most importantly isn't going to raise the price of electricity to consumers so much that that really becomes the predominant problem in the future.
Thank you. Ben, a very smart lady by the name of Anne Quaruns argues in a book, Turning Oil into Salt, that we have to strip oil of its strategic value with economic alternatives. With that in mind, does reframing energy independence to energy security in the context of discovering, deploying, and maintaining readily available economic alternatives make sense?
You know, that's a great question because, you know, before I attended this area, you and I had a chance to talk about that and how that was a strategic commodity around the world. As I talk to my colleagues around the world, right, today we've been kind of inwardly focused talking about participants in the state of Florida. But let's take a look at what the other worlds look at and what other economies look at us as regarding energy independence, using that terminology, or energy security. And one of my colleagues actually invited me to, give you two definitions that they saw from a worldwide perspective, China and Europe. They defined independence as a condition of a nation, country, or state and a population of, or some portion thereof, to exercise self-government, generally looking inwardly focused, right? The Chinese had built the Great Wall to actually be independent and exclude other nations around the world. But they look at security as totally not independent, but interdependent, right? And we'll talk about four elements that really comes out of the book very strong in what we've seen around the world. Security has a different connotation, that it has to be compared to related concepts, right? Safety, continuity. And the key difference here is that security must take into account the actions of people outside the jurisdiction, right? They understand that the terminology interdependence is very much the term affiliated with security versus independence. And they gave me four examples why maybe this is the way to go to frame energy security as the terminology versus independence. They called out four basic areas: rare earth elements, the political views, which we've touched on already around the world, water, that Eric touched on, and of course what IBM's concerned about, information technology. Let's start with the first one. Rare earth elements. It's interesting that the United States has 15% of the rare earth elements that actually helps deliver energy, store energy, and even consume energy. Yet almost 95% of the processing of the earth elements actually occurs in China. In fact, today in the United States, there's no really a processing company that can take those rare earth elements and deliver it for our use in energy. Now, what's interesting about Florida is that your strong Department of Defense, right? Some people from the NASA Kennedy Space Center and even some of the DoD agencies, they actually understood that in the Department of Defense, because the same materials that we're fighting for energy have always been used in the Department of Defense and Ministry of Defense, right? So it was a security type aspect, because the same materials that we use for storage of energy is used for sonar detection, for laser detection, for missiles and firing. So, that analogy is actually there. And talk about the second thing, right? With China actually processing, almost 95% of the rare earth elements that we use. China looks at this and some of the other countries as their reservation, right? And they have those materials, and now they're starting to understand that. On a call that we had last week with all the global teams in IBM, Russia and the Middle East also understands that as well. They actually have close to 90% of the oil reserves and natural gas, and they do now understand that, and that the U.S. is very dependent on it. And as we've alluded to, it's been a very volatile relationship with those two individuals, and whether we agree or disagree, their political views actually can change their energy security policy. And as we know, it's kind of like a chessboard. You can't refuse to move, right? The cost of not doing something on that chessboard is going to cost you something. Well, we know these countries are actually moving the chess pieces around today. In fact, in the UK last week, they're having the same conversations that this forum is having in the United Kingdom with multiple energy sources, so they understand it. So you've got the political view. So you've got the rare earth elements tied to the political view. But let's move to water. 1/5 of the world's population has no access to clean water. I don't know if we realize that, right? And the world is globalizing. So if that ever becomes an imperative here because we cannot provide the appropriate energy source to actually clean that water, we're in a dismal situation, right? Competing for resources versus being interdependent and actually trading and dealing with these resources. And the fourth and final thing, right, why energy security versus energy independence. IBM sees this, and we've been seeing it for the last 10 to 15 years. Almost everybody in this audience has a smartphone. I've seen a lot of iPhones. We've seen BlackBerries all over the place. What has got us today, right, to the quality of life in the U.S., much less Florida, is this technology. Almost everything is internet applicable, right? We can all turn off our homes now using iPhone and iPod, your smartphone. You can actually now see your bill with Florida Power and Light and other utilities. But that same technology that has gotten us is now exposed, right? That information technology is growing faster than our own cybersecurity capability to protect that infrastructure. So should it be security or should it be independence? It seems intuitive to me right? Given just those four elements, that it should be security. So I think in our best interest, as other worlds are looking and reframing their discussion around security, we ought to consider reframing it in the same way.
Follow on, very quick answer if you could. With a system as complex as energy, and that being your expertise, what is it that the U.S. and Florida should be doing to maximize our flexibility?
Absolutely. You know, it's actually a very simple question. It's very concise. In all complex systems that we've seen all around the world, whether they be smart grids, you know, airline systems, healthcare systems, the four factors, and you can see it in all the literature, that prevent us from being successful is what I acronym, right? Being with IBM, acronym it, call it the PEST, right? It's a PEST. It's the political, the economical, the social, and technical factors that all are on different time frames and different resources. They enter and exit in different perspectives. But those four wheels, those four gears, are all actually very interrelated. The best way to deal with changing this complex system, if you look at, again, all the literature to deal with pest, again, the political, the economical, social, and technical, comes down to being smart. And that's why IBM has adopted the term smart. If you're going to take that next move forward, right, not talking about it hallway conversations, and we don't want to be sitting in these chairs, you know, dreaming of what could be, we've got to be very smart. And that's another acronym, right? SMART. We've got to start measuring where we want to be across those four circles. We've got to be able to audit our actions, right? We're not going to get the right answer immediately, but we've got to understand that we've got to move. Tacit knowledge in this room and across the state of Florida has got to be reusable, right? It's got to be not only in our generation, but the generations coming, and we've got to be able to trace back how we change those four wheels called PEST in order to better our livelihood. So real quick, let's think about this pest that's on all our backs. Let's take some action, and let's be smart about what we do.
Awesome. Thank you. Jeremy, having just come out of the governor's energy office and knowing very well what the president's goals are, he has stated that energy independence, and of course we've all sort of defined here that he really meant to say security, from foreign sources is the most important issue our economy will face. How soon can Florida achieve energy security, and what's the best path to get there?
Well, there's no doubt that energy is the lifeblood of our economy. It's an operating cost that our households have, our businesses have. So there's no doubt that it is the fulcrum of energy security. When you speak to energy independence, though, I think there's some disconnect there because immediately we go into the debate between solar and wind when none of our cars run on solar and wind. I think the most prudent thing to do is kind of an asset mapping and looking at the state of Florida. I see the Commissioner of Agriculture in here, and he has labeled us as the Saudi Arabia of biomass. We have the richest county, or the second richest county in the state in terms of biomass in Palm Beach County. There's a federal mandate for 36 billion gallons per year of ethanol by the year 2022. There's multiple tax incentives that are being discussed at the federal level right now in House Bill 4940. You have all these economic legs, and in 2008, Mr. Szilagyi referred to the resource block for the electricity. What hasn't really gotten much of attention is the renewable fuel standard on the transportation side of the equation. And looking at that, particularly, that has driven investment in our ports. When I first worked in the governor's energy office, we had a 90-10 split of 90% gasoline, 10% ethanol. We pumped it in our tanks. However, we transported it via the tankers that you mix 90%, you put 10% ethanol, you hope he hits a couple potholes and mixes it up. Now we have real online injection facilities at our ports. Kinder Morgan has demonstrated through its pipeline from Orlando to Tampa that you can transport ethanol. So you have the infrastructure in place, you have nearly 600 flex fuel vehicles, you have 44 fueling stations throughout 34 cities in Florida, and the Energy Office has a $10 million revolving loan fund to enhance that to 134 by the end of the year if there's a lending institution that takes that. So with that said, I think there is room not only on the transportation side to put Florida as a leader in renewables, putting biofuels, cellulosic, biodiesel at the forefront, but also on the renewable electricity side. As a panelist stated earlier, it only took one session to go from nearly last in the United States to second in the deployment of utility-scale solar. And everyone is focused on whether we need 20% by 2020. I would have to see the study behind that and how they arrived at that number. If it's merely a 20 by 20 because it's rhymed, then it's more energy politics than policy.
Former CIA Director James Woolsey had an article in the Wall Street Journal recently where he said we can replace approximately half of the U.S. autos with electric and plug-in hybrids without adding additional generating capacity. So with that context in mind, Bob, there's been a lot of debate about which renewable energy technologies are best suited to help achieve security. In your opinion, which renewable energy technology has the greatest growth potential in Florida?
Well, to a great extent, we've talked about many of those this morning, but I thought what I would do is mention two or three relevant, in a couple cases, breakthroughs at our lab over the past year that I think are producing technology that would work extremely well here. Let me start with efficiency. We have, I'm sure most people here are familiar with these light-emitting diodes, you know, the LED lighting that has such great promise for high-efficiency lighting. So if we're talking about efficiency, one of the things that we're trying to do with these LEDs is that currently the light is produced from just the blue and red spectrum, part of the spectrum. We've had a team working on trying to get the green spectrum into the mix, which would close a very critical gap in the technology in terms of efficiency and value and getting rid of some of the objectionable light. And we're very close now to doing that. So LEDs looks like a technology that's going to take a quantum leap here in the next year, and that can be used anywhere, as Walmart is proving installing it in all of their new superstores. More to the sort of climate differential that we see here and other versus other states, we have known for a long time that evaporative cooling is a very efficient way to condition space for cooling, and but it works principally in climates like Denver, where it doesn't get real hot and it certainly doesn't get very humid. How do you get something that works in Florida? We just announced last week a breakthrough in some air conditioning technology in which we now have a technology that combines membranes, the evaporative cooling technology, but also these liquid desiccants that can be used to take the humidity out of the air that then is subsequently cooled, and will reduce air conditioning costs by 50 to 90%. That's the technology. We don't have it commercialized. We're looking for a commercial partner, which is typically what the lab does, and hope to have that in 2 to 3 years. So I think that clearly in this environment here is something that will work well in Florida once it's commercial at a scale that Mr. Szilagyi and others have talked about. It needs to be done to reduce the cost and make sure we're balancing cost versus benefit. And the last thing is we just learned this morning, actually, I just saw this on my BlackBerry, that the lab has won a recognition from R&D Magazine for one of the top 100 technology innovations last year, which is a new PV system that we invented with a company called Aminex, which for the first time produces at the system level out in the field a 25% efficiency for a highly concentrated multi-junction PV cell, multi-junction being the most efficient technology that's out there at the moment. This has great potential, again, to getting us to speed and scale, not only here but around the country. And that technology is basically ready to move in the marketplace. It's a big system. It's rated at 53 kilowatts, so its commercial scale use can be put in a matter of days instead of weeks and months like typical systems today. So those are the kinds of things that I think are relevant to, here and perhaps more broadly to the Southeast.
Thank you. Eli, I have a three-part question for you, so hang with me while I work my way through it. How can Florida contribute to the nation's goal of energy security through renewable energy first? Secondly, what are you doing at NASA to meet a national goal of energy security, and what policy lessons can we as Floridians take from NASA's experience in that regard?
Great question, Jack. I think in order for Florida to contribute, we need to accomplish two things. The first thing is we need to understand the importance of renewable energy. With after hearing people today, it sounds like we're in a really good direction. And second, we need to take the next step and invest. Now, there's three primary reasons we at the Kennedy Space Center feel renewable energy is important. For one, it reduces our reliance upon fossil fuels, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions and stimulating the local economy. The second primary reason we came up with is that it provides jobs. Now, depending on what type of technology you speak of, there's a wide range of both direct and indirect jobs. One that we've looked at specifically is solar, which I think a lot of people believe provides the most direct jobs. Now, Department of Energy study we looked at quantified that for every 1 megawatt of solar you created, there was at least 25 jobs created. So we're really interested in looking at what solar can do for us in the future. And the last reason renewable energy is important is that it protects residents from price inflation by reducing the need to expand existing power plants. So an example of how we can contribute, a project we heard of briefly earlier is an enhanced use lease agreement we have with Florida Power and Light at the Kennedy Space Center, in which case we constructed 11 megawatt photovoltaic installation. The agreement had a 10 megawatt portion built on KSC property for Brevard County residents, in return, I should say, for a 1 megawatt solar PV installation for the Kennedy Space Center. Now, I personally have been inspecting that for the last 8 months that we've had that 1 megawatt portion, and we've revealed actually considerably more savings than we had originally predicted, which we originally believed to be already a cost-effective installation. And where that unpredicted benefit came from was in those peak demand moments where it reduces a kilowatt demand, which for those commercial entities out there understand that's a fairly large portion of your electric bill. So it's with projects like this that Florida can contribute to the nation's goal of energy security.
Thank you. Roy, you know, we've seen price increases in fuel sources over the years. Recently, saw a dramatic increase in the last couple of years. Yet 2% of Florida's energy comes from renewable resources. How critical is it that we begin to make investments now, number one? And number two, where should that investment be? You know, asking you sort of as a scientist on the continuum from basic research to ultimate field deployment of systems.
For me, I need to frame this question and I need to frame this discussion so that we can decide where to go. And I think what I heard today is our goals are up there. I think we can all agree that we're going to protect the environment, grow the economy, and ensure the security of the state. Once we've gotten agreement on those goals, I think the next slide, we need to agree on a singular vision. Before we talk about implementation, whether we do solar, whether we do biomass, there needs to be a singular vision. And we need to all agree to that vision, and we need to be realistic about the words we use in that vision. And the word I heard today, and one that I completely agree with, and that's why I left California to come to Florida and join Scripps, is I heard we want to be a leader in clean energy. I don't think I need to explain why clean energy. That's an enormous opportunity, and no one has yet met that need. So it's an opportunity. I think the word that we need to focus on there and ask if we're realistic about it, and I think we can be, is the word leader. Why do we need to be a leader? Well, if we want to enjoy the economic benefits of clean energy, we need to be the leader, right? If California will generate cheaper PVs than we will, no one will buy our PVs, right? If Texas does it, and they're in competition with us, so we've got to be the leader if we want to enjoy the economic benefits. We could decide to be a follower, and strategically, it makes more sense if you're going to be a follower to acknowledge that. But I think we can be a leader, and I think that's what I'm hearing. So recognizing that the competition is strong, recognizing that we can play the role of a leader, we must play the role of a leader. And the next slide, how do we implement that vision? Right? We need to be realistic about what it's going to take to implement that vision. And there are two things I want to focus on there. and I'll give you a little bit of sense of what role Scripps is going to play in this. But before I go to that, I think related to some of the questions and related to what we want to do at Scripps, is it's very important that we focus our resources. You know, we have limited resources we can dedicate to this vision. And I don't think we can let scientists run rampant doing whatever they want, let companies do whatever we want. We need to make sure that everything we're doing is consistent with that vision, that builds towards that vision. And I think there can be approaches that we can limit. That has an impact on leading science. One of the reasons I'm here is to try to develop a department in clean energy at Scripps. We are trying to develop completely new science that will create paradigm change. That requires a tremendous amount of resources. If we're committing resources all to short-term approaches, there's no resources left to look for paradigm change. And if we're going to be leaders, we better have the best science. We better have the best technology. So some of the things that we're working on, for example, is learning how to convert natural gas to petroleum cheaply. If we can do that, we will replace petroleum. The sources of natural gas are much more abundant than petroleum. We're stuck with fossil fuels. You've seen that. 2050, we're going to be using fossil fuels. Let's use it 3 times more efficiently. Right? We pump out 3 times less CO2. We're 3 times less dependent. To do that requires a paradigm change in our science. No longer can we use heated and beat-it science to generate energy. Right? That's one of the things we're working on. Last, and this is not the only thing we're working on, but I do want to make a comment on one of the things that we see is very important is to give us an alternative to biofuels. What is biofuels? It's really taking light energy and using a plant machine to generate a fuel from that light energy. So our vision, which is shown on the next slide, is we generate electricity, pump it on the grid. A solar cell is much more efficient than a leaf. We use that electricity and build a factory to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and generate fuels. We'll always need fuels. We have an infrastructure for carbon fuels. Let's generate it from CO2. That's what plants do. But we can do it much more efficiently in a factory. Right? If we start down that road, we'll get there. We'll focus our resources and get there. So absolutely, I think PV is an important part. I think there's other forms of alternative energy that's an important part, but I think there's a lot of missing science, and we've got to decide whether we want to be a leader or the follower.
I'll give you a very quick follow-on. Short answer. Are there examples of the type technology that you just described of extracting in bulk chemicals from the air and using them in some capacity? Have we got the production technology for something or a roadmap?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and I'll try to make this short. You know, I don't think we have, and including me, have a real grasp of the size of the energy. You know, you hear these numbers, quads. So what I've done is I've looked back into the history of technology, and I've said, is there a massive scale product that we made, that we humans make, that is of the scale, maybe a 10-time factor less, but of the scale of fuels? And is that a technology where we had the choice to go the biological way or to go the artificial way and extract it from the atmosphere? And that chemical is fertilizer, ammonia. We had a choice: go the biological route, use cows and legumes, and go the old-fashioned way. What we do today is we build a billion-dollar factory. We pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere. We use 2% of the world's energy to generate ammonia that's in your body. We don't do it using biological systems. We do it with a factory, and we pull it out of the atmosphere. We can do the same thing with CO2. But the science is missing. But this is America. That's what we do. We put people on the moon. We generate the transistor. Not YouTube. That's not going to get us anywhere.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump to you, Susan, if you're okay. This thing is puzzling me and has been bothering me for a while. What is it about energy that requires a policy? You know, why don't we have a refrigerator policy or a car policy or a pharmaceutical policy? Why do we need an energy policy?
Well, I would say that we do have policies for pharmaceuticals. We've got policies for refrigerators. We've got policies for cars, planes. But many of these technologies were developed when government started to develop policies, to establish policies. When we look at why policies are established, many of them have come out of accidents, as a result of accidents, or unintended consequences. And with energy, I would say that we're going into a very new evolving area in many of our renewable and alternative energy areas. And so we need to be proactive in developing policies to looking at what are the potential unintended consequences to mitigating risk and ensuring security. I'll kind of segue right away into the area that we haven't talked about yet, which is ocean renewable energy. This is definitely an area that there is very little known about. If you talk about the knowledge base, the data that's available for operating in the offshore continental shelf, where is it? We don't know enough about things like migratory patterns of sea turtles. We don't know enough about the interactions of the environment. If you look at the ocean current, the Gulf Stream, now you're talking about not only U.S. and federal policy, state policies, but you're also talking about global policies, because we share a resource not only with the Bahamas, but also one that goes all the way up to the UK and to parts of Europe. And believe me, there have been a lot of questions alone on what are we going to do about policy when it comes to people in Ireland who really don't want to give up the palm trees that exist on their southern shores. But if you talk about policy, we really do need to think about how we interact, how we get the regulatory framework working together, because there is so little known about this area. We know a lot about what happens on land. We've got policies developed at the state and federal level for addressing biofuels, addressing cars, addressing many aspects, oil and gas. But when you start going offshore, there's very little known. And that is I would say, a spaghetti network of trying to work and understand what is known, what needs to be asked, what needs to have policy developed around it, so that we ensure that when we get together and make decisions, that they're balanced and they're well-informed decisions, and we've got all the stakeholders at the table, so that when we look at the state of Florida, which, by the way, is about the second largest state as far as a continuous coastline, we now have to start asking ourselves about things like marine spatial planning, multi-use in the ocean, which agencies, both at the federal and state level, have jurisdiction. And I'll just throw one other thing here. If you talk about offshore wind, Minerals Management Service, if it's offshore, has the responsibility. That's the Department of Interior. Now, if you talk about hydrokinetic, marine hydrokinetic, if you're talking about within the CZM or the Coastal Zone Management Area, that's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. If you talk about the offshore continental shelf, which on the east coast of Florida is beyond 3 miles going east, that's Minerals Management Service. And when you then take and transmit to shore, you also have to engage FERC. So now you've got just those alone, not to mention the fact, if you're talking offshore or ocean thermal energy conversion, NOAA is involved. And they're the regulatory body for ocean thermal energy conversion in the offshore continental shelf. So you get just that grouping along with fish and wildlife, marine fisheries, Army Corps of Engineers, Federal Communications Commission, U.S. Coast Guard, Department of Environmental Protection and the Energy Office at the state of Florida. You now get a whole grouping of people, agencies that are trying to figure out what their role is, what their responsibility is, and how are we going to develop the policy that helps the designer, the developer, the university, like I have at Florida Atlantic University, to move forward in research and development. You've got to get all the stakeholders together, and we've got to work on that policy.
Thank you.
I know that was a little long-winded, but it's complex.
You know, this seems to be an era of concern by some with increasing government involvement in traditional roles of the private sector. What role should government play in energy policy and renewable technology development and implementation, and what role should private enterprise play from your perspective?
But I think the role the government should continue to play is promote positive investment with tax incentive and grants. Now, depending on which state you go to, there's a wide range of incentives and grants, so we need to continue those tax incentives, the rebates and loan programs that help us promote the renewable energy investments. The second role I think the government should play is promote renewable energy implementation, which once again, depending on what layer we either do or do not have policies in place. From a federal side, for example, with legislatures such as the Energy Policy Act of 2005, we're required by law to have 5% of our electricity in 2010 come from renewables. Now, while 5% doesn't actually sound like too much, in 2009, Kennedy Space Center had 240 gigawatt hours of electricity, so 5% real quickly became a large task. Now, with the Florida Power and Light enhanced use lease I spoke of earlier, even with that large installation, which is one of the largest in Florida today, it was barely 1% of our electricity demand. So what a lot of agencies are having to do is buy what's called renewable energy credits. And the last role I think the government should play is just promote energy reduction efforts. I think it was said earlier that the best way to accomplish this is to not have the energy in general. Now, on the federal side, like I was saying earlier, there's actually legislation currently at stake that it's called the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which actually requires us to reduce our energy intensity by 30% by 2015, which equates from a 2003 baseline at 3% a year. So the Kennedy Space Center, like most federal agencies, is having real tough times with that. 3% a year doesn't sound like much, but like I was making the point earlier, when you start talking about large quantities of energy and you start talking about mission changes like we're dealing with right now, it actually becomes a pretty difficult task. Now, what Kennedy Space Center is doing to kind of take this a step further, which I believe a lot of federal agencies are doing, is implementing the U.S. Green Bill Council's LEED silver rating minimum. So for every project we have that comes through with either a new construction or renovation, we require that it at least achieve a LEED silver rating. In fact, we have a project right now that's at stake to be the first NASA LEED Platinum facility, the Propellants North project. So with efforts like that, included with, we have some Energy Star and FEMP requirements that I think a lot of people are seeing a lot of good initiatives with as well. Now, as far as the private industry, I don't speak directly from experience on this one, but I think to continue marketing the renewable energies to compete in lower costs, I think is important, but also to continue efforts with advancing efficiencies in the applications of renewable energy technologies.
Jeremy, I'm going to come back to you again. This is a hardball, okay? Particularly with you just coming out of the governor's office. Is the most effective way to achieve an energy security in Florida through a renewable energy standard? And whether it is or not, how much renewable energy is enough? You know, what's an appropriate level that we should be looking for to sort of protect ourselves from those hostile and unpredictable sources out there that we currently buy from?
No, it's an excellent question, and ever since I've been in government, it's been asked and never truly been answered, at least to everyone's liking. I think the most important thing you do is you set up your fundamental policy objectives. To the extent renewable portfolio standard is designed for a sustainable way to wean yourself off of fossil fuels, then that puts greater importance on the percentage that you would want to have and you would need to calculate when your fossil fuels would be depleted and when the renewables would take over for a sustainable society. To the extent it's a tool used to design a reduction in greenhouse gas, then I think the more appropriate tool would be a carbon cap, where you would have a greenhouse gas cap, and then you would let market forces navigate the way to the least cost strategy of meeting that carbon cap. So it's an interesting question, and I honestly don't know how to answer it other than to go back to what we've already done in Florida, and that's in 2008, there was a resource block of 110 megawatts. And you've seen Florida go from nearly zero in utility scale solar deployment to second only to California. And although I wasn't privy to the legislation last year, my understanding of it that it was crafted in such a way that it would position Florida to bring in manufacturing. So if you're going to bring back manufacturing, and someone mentioned diversity on the panel, not only would you want diversity in your fuel mix, but you want diversity in your economy. You don't want to just be an economy that relies on tourism. People that were privy to balancing the budget last year, it's going to be even more difficult with tourism down this year and the lack of revenue and tax dollars coming in. You just don't want to be an agriculture state. To the extent you could have more of a knowledge-based economy predicated on clean energy deployment, whether it's in the state, in the United States, or internationally, I think you would diversify your economy and position you in such that you wouldn't feel the sways of the national economy going up and down, but more of a level economy.
Susan, I'm going to come back to you, an audience question directed at you, and it's what is the main game changer that needs to happen to make ocean energy a player in renewables in the U.S.?
Well, I would say one of the things that needs to be worked on very carefully right now is the whole regulatory process. It is going to be incumbent on us as a university to be that, if you will, that guinea pig in making sure that we've helped the regulatory bodies work through their morass, if you will, and become a unified body so that when companies come along, it's going to facilitate their work. But as far as technology goes, I think that when it comes to the forms of renewable energy, ocean renewable energy, the one that has the potential off the state of Florida and it seems to be coming in nearer term is ocean thermal energy conversion. And it may have the greatest potential for renewable energy off of Florida and other places around the world.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, this is, I'm going to come back to Bob. This question is, LEDs offer real energy savings and a quick payback. We need to get LED products approved and on the DOT QPL, that mean anything? OPL?
Not to me, no.
List and federal products list. So.
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the first list. There is a federal products list which encourages the selection of certain products for purchase. But I'm not really clear about the question. I think the bigger, I might answer it this way. I think the bigger, to go back to my example earlier with Walmart, the big box retail industry now is beginning to really relook at how they build new stores, not so much retrofit what they have, but build new stores. And to the extent that they're doing the kinds of things that Walmart and others, but especially Walmart, are doing with respect to lighting and transportation and everything else relative to their business, I think that's where the biggest bang for the buck is going to be. That's where we're going to get scale and speed of introduction of a technology like LEDs into the marketplace. And by the way, when Walmart opens a new superstore, they are so proud of the energy efficiencies that they've introduced in the store, they invite their competitors to opening day and walk them around and show them what they've done with respect to LED lighting and a lot of other things. So Lowe's and everybody else gets to come and sort of see them. So it gets back to kind of a leadership thing, not so much for the government on a preferred product list, but how a major sector of the economy is responding.
Thank you. Ben, when discussing energy security, how does a diversified grid come into play?
Oh, yeah. How does a diversified grid come into play with regarding security, right? It's kind of like having choices alternatives. Anytime you have a number of alternatives that are very specific, can be estimated and can be governed and actually changed ad hoc, kind of a sense and respond, it mitigates risk, right? It mitigates risk in 2 or 3 areas that we all know in our daily lives. You can handle the knowns, right? You know this is going to occur when you have a diversified portfolio. You can actually mitigate risk on the unknowables, meaning there is a risk that the platform in the Gulf might spill over, but you can try to handle that. But it also, a diverse portfolio really handles really well what we call unknowables, right? Things that may occur, you've got options to actually pursue. You've got a fork in the road. So just like anything else, energy mimics inventory, it mimics people as far as diversification, it mimics cash flow. You've got your bonds, you've got your stocks. So diversification is a way to mitigate risk and uncertainty.
Thank you. Barney, this is to you. And it says, essentially, if 20% is a non-starter, what number, percent or otherwise, is a starter? And follows with the understanding that we're currently producing 3 to 4% energy from renewables.
Okay. I would be reluctant to say what that number is because I can't speak for an entire industry. But clearly 20% by 2020 is unattainable and is too expensive and is not realistic. And the three things I indicated at the beginning is that we have to be affordable, it has to be reliable, and most importantly, it has to be sustainable. So what that number is, I suggested a single-digit number is something that's going to be much more likely. I wasn't cognizant of the fact that we have 3-4% renewables in Florida now. My understanding was about 1.5%. But it's going to be a number that's going to be substantially less than 20% by 2020. I think that is a number that really is off the books. If that's the starting point for anybody in the renewable arena to talk to policymakers about, you can't even really have a discussion. What you have to do is, first off, think about what it's going to cost consumers to buy. In this economy, cost is the most important issue. Frankly, the most important issue for Floridians right now is, are they going to have a job today? Are they going to have a job tomorrow? Is their son or daughter going to have a job next week? Are they going to be able to keep their homes? Energy, however, is something that we all have to consume, and business community does it too. We want it as reasonable priced as we can get it. At the same time, we understand that there are other issues that play into the energy arena and that we have to be cognizant of those. And so we're willing to be a part of the solution. But in sitting down, it has to be among reasonableness, has to be an important consideration. So I couldn't say what that number is. I shouldn't say what that number is because I'm not smart enough to know that. I don't have that kind of expertise in that arena. But we are willing to sit down and talk, and AIF has played a leading role in bringing folks together and trying to make that happen.
Bob, you had a...
Yeah, I'd like to address that. We do have some numbers based on a study that the lab did about 1.5 years ago relative to wind, and it was a very robust and peer-reviewed piece of work, which is typically what we try to do, and feel pretty confident that based on our analysis and the modeling that we did, that we can get to 20% wind by 2030. That's not to say it's not challenging, and it's going to take the kinds of trade-offs here that I think we've been talking about with the senator and others, and there's maybe about half of that again for solar in that time frame. So I don't disagree with Bernie's point necessarily based on our analysis on the time frame between now and 2020, but certainly by 2030, again, if we do the kinds of things that have been talked about today, whether it's in Florida or in the nation in general, speaking now from a technology innovation side of this, I think we can get there. And one parenthetical is that we won't get there if we lack some certainty in the marketplace over the next few years. A lot has been said about that. It also applies in the R&D environment, as these guys know. And the reason for that is this, that when we started in 1978 doing research on renewables for the first time as the country's principal research center, If you remember Mr. Holland's curve on average world oil prices or average domestic oil prices, if you overlay on that the investment at NREL over that time frame, it's almost in a perfect agreement. And what that has done, that has implications. We had a guy working on organic solar cells, which had a tremendous opportunity to be a game changer in the marketplace, left in 1982 because he didn't think there was a future, won a Nobel Prize a few years ago in photoelectrochemistry for that work. So imagine what might have happened if we had this kind of certainty and predictability and consistency.
Barney, you had.
Yeah, I would just say that I respect what he is saying, but 30% wind by 20% wind by 2030 isn't going to be applicable in Florida. Solar is going to be the better opportunity. The problem with wind power primarily is that we don't have enough wind blowing consistently strong enough in places in Florida to do that. That's why most of the, for example, Florida Power and Light, which is the largest producer of wind energy in the country, does that out in Texas and Colorado and Southern California, not in Florida. So while wind energy is something that we should certainly look at, we're not going to get in Florida 20% by 2050. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I want to make, sure, and absolutely. I was talking about a national goal based on our state.
Thank this august panel.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Office of Research and Commercialization.